Great. Thanks, Sam. So, hi there. Good morning, afternoon, evening, whatever time of day it is in your time zone or when you're listening to this talk. I'm Chris Wilson, and I'm here to talk about the history of the web, especially about its humble beginnings in the early 1990s through the high and low points of the browser wars to today. And I have to be honest, this talk is pure nostalgia for me. But there is a strong thread of see how this early history impacts today's web, because of course, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. Now, much like Mel Brooks' classic movie, and if you haven't seen History of the World Part 1, just hit pause, go watch the movie, come back, I'll be here. I have to skip a lot of history. The first deck I pulled together for this talk would have run easily over an hour and a half. And also like Mel's movie, this talk's kind of skewed to early history. But I want to introduce myself. I've been working on the web platform a super long time, over 27 years. I've been an engineer, a program manager, a group program manager, developer advocate, standards editor, working group chair. I worked on very early browsers and then spent 15 years at Microsoft, most of it on Internet Explorer, and came to Google just over 10 years ago, right after we shipped Chrome version 6. So that's approximately 80 releases of Chrome ago. And I think that probably made me feel older than anything else in this talk, to be honest. But I'm currently in the Chrome TPGM team. I represent Google at the W3C. And there's more to this talk, by the way, than just Internet Explorer. But I still think that Internet Explorer and a lot of the driving factors behind IE really were critically important to getting us where we are today. And I wanted to start out by saying, by the way, and so you don't get the wrong idea, I don't think I'm the smartest person in the room. I didn't invent the web or anything. But to borrow a Hamilton quote, I have been in the room where it happened many times over the years. So cast your minds back to, well, possibly before you were born. In 1988, I went to the University of Illinois as an undergraduate. And to give you a picture of the prevalence of the internet to the public back then, really pretty much no one had heard of it. It was still commonly known as ARPANET. My incoming undergraduate class was not even issued student email addresses. You had to go into the computer lab and request one. And in fact, that email account was on a mainframe system. And you had a time limit of like 7 hours each week, which I would immediately burn up at the beginning of the week playing Ultimate Larn or ULarn. This is kind of like Rogue, if you've ever heard of it, but text-based adventure. And I would usually burn through all my time in the first couple days of the week, and then I couldn't check my email again until Saturday morning. Now, thankfully, the engineering students got a separate account for classwork, different mainframe, no time limit, no ULarn installed either. So clearly I managed to pass my computer science classes. This was my first internet terminal. It was a cast-off HP 2622A terminal from the early 1980s, and it was out of date when I got it, free from my boss at a summer job, but I connected it to the U of I's system via a smoking fast 2400 baud modem. This modem, as a matter of fact, that I have right here. And for reference, my cell phone currently gets an approximately 6,000 times faster connection, a 60,000 times faster connection on my net connection here at home. For reference, this is about the speed of the average hotel room Wi-Fi, especially in Mountain View. But of course, this was just a text terminal. Connection speed wasn't actually as important. ASCII was all we could get anyways. Now, don't get the idea this is like computers were all text-based or non-visual. The Nintendo NES had come out a few years before this, such an improvement over the Atari 2600. But I wanted to set your expectations because the natural order of things at the time was pretty different from today. And don't worry, my presentation today is not just a long stream of Douglas Adams quotes. You can take bets on how many there are, though. And if you don't know who Douglas Adams was, there's another research project for you later. You're welcome. But this quote is amazingly true. Anything invented before you're born is just the way the world works. I have two kids, 10 and 15, and it's amazing what the world is to them. They don't remember a world before smartphones. The younger one was actually born after the iPhone was released. But anything that's invented between your 15 and 35 is new and exciting, and you can probably get a career in it, like I did. Anything invented after you're 35, though, is against the natural order of things. And of course, I'm not really here to say, get off my lawn, you whippersnappers. The web's been done, and everything you might build is against the natural order of things. I should be clear, I turned 35 before Chrome was released. Now, the challenge, though, to me is how to figure out how to be amazed and excited by things that are against that natural order. Go figure out how they occurred and further change the natural order in interesting ways. Keep your natural order flexible. But in 1991, I got a part-time job at the National Center for Supercomputing Applications at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and that is the only time I'm going to say that fully spelled out. The NCSA was one of the 5 original National Science Foundation supercomputing centers. Our group's mission was to build software tools to enable researchers to use desktop-level workstations to unlock the power of the supercomputers for research purposes. So we built software tools like Telnet. I mean, yes, we literally built the terminal program because I was hired, in fact, to work on PC Telnet because this was pre-Windows 95. There wasn't even a TCP/IP stack in Microsoft operating systems. PC Telnet was DOS software when I started there. And we had our own network stack. We had individual drivers for network cards. I remember debugging the TCP resend fallback algorithm and writing network card drivers. Now, we also built image and data visualization tools, so it wasn't all text, but a lot of low-level tooling. Now, I graduated in 1992, but I liked my part-time job so much I stayed there after graduation, turned it into a full-time job, heading up the Windows software team of undergraduate students. And in 1993, a couple of guys at NCSA came up with a project on X Windows they called Mosaic, which accessed and displayed internet content from FTP, Gopher, and some new thing a guy in Switzerland had come up with called the World Wide Web. And it used a prototype document language called HTML. And by the way, yes, this is me in 1993 at the first web conference ever, the Web Wizards workshop that was hosted by O'Reilly. And so I co-wrote the Windows version of NCSA Mosaic. This was the first really mass market desktop browser. And by the way, this has utterly ruined the word mosaic for me. I never get a mental picture of something like this. When somebody uses the word mosaic, I have to think about it because my brain flashes up this. And throughout this talk, I'm going to identify some life lessons that I've picked up. Feel free to ignore them. There's not going to be a quiz later or anything. But the first one of these lessons is choose your product names and code names really carefully because those words may be forever tainted for you. And by the way, I was reminded on Twitter by Henri Helvetica that today is actually the anniversary of Windows Mosaic's V1 release. V1 was released 27 years ago today on November 11th. But keep in mind at this point, you typically, like I said, you didn't even have network support for Windows. Windows didn't come with TCP/IP. You could buy a separate package from a third party that was going to be hundreds of dollars. And then you had to pay for dial-up service to get connected usually, because this was measured in dollars per minute over a telephone line. Like we had to provide our own stack all the way down to the network drivers for Mosaic. Now, we already had our network stack from PC Telnet, so we ported the network code to Windows. We built the HTML parsing and rendering code and got Mosaic up and running. And we put a beta of Windows Mosaic up on the FTP server. And I remember we were cheering when we saw that we ticked past 1,000 downloads in a week. Now, by contrast, Chrome has upwards of 3 billion users, a really fast uptake rate for auto-updating. So we are affecting users at a rate that is literally 1 million times faster than this. But what was really, really surprising at this time frame was that the game Doom came out that same year. We still managed to get work done in Mosaic, even though we had lots of early LAN parties. But I want to underscore, we were college kids here driving this project. Like, we didn't really have a plan or an idea what we were doing or how to build software even. We got to build Mosaic, even though it wasn't part of our original charter, because it was an interesting software tool for education and research. And that was NCSA's overall charter. We had a lot of freedom to build tools that would help education. And we didn't really need a business plan to do most of it. Now, I guess there were a lot of .coms that probably felt they didn't need a business plan a few years later too, but it worked a little better for us. Now, granted, we were working on a shoestring, like there were 2 of us working on NCSA Mosaic for Windows, and we didn't have network drive sharing software for Windows because it was really expensive. So we would like call across the room and say, hey, are you working in this file? And then copy code on a zip drive and walk it across the office to the other person's machine to keep updated. Now, there were no user experience courses in my computer science curriculum, no theory of software testing, and that probably showed too in the end. But this freedom to go down rabbit holes and explore new ideas is an amazing tool. And this is what I really loved about Google's 20% time concept when I joined Google was, people outside the company thought this was like you take a day off a week or something, but it's really a license to explore things that aren't part of your core job. And this is a really important lesson that I took away from this time. Now, this isn't to say we didn't make some foolish choices sometimes when we were exploring ideas of what you could possibly do. For example, I am personally responsible for overlapping bold and italic tags working in the early web for this rampant violation of all common sense, all SGML structured element decency in parsing, because I thought it would be interesting to make this work like, a highlighter on text. And this, by the way, is a bad idea. I first implemented this in Mosaic in late 1993. In my defense, such as it is, I thought it would be cool at the time. And by the way, we still support this in Chrome and other modern browsers today. But what made the early web so compelling, so amazing, so enduring, so, dare I say, viral, is, in short, because it gave access to information. And Google's mission is to organize the world's information and make it universally accessible and useful. And it's important to realize that the world's information in the early 1990s, it wasn't even on the internet. It might not even be in digital form. Like, I literally had a set of physical encyclopedias as a kid. I'm not kidding, like actual paper books. But information was starting to come online, and the ephemerality of web experiences was a perfect platform for this. And as an aside, if you're new to Google, haven't thought about it in a while, or you're one of the viewers of this who aren't a Googler, Google's mission is actually really awesome. This is what I love about working for Google is, yes, in my opinion, it'd be nice if we added something in there about prioritizing truth, but organizing information and making it accessible and useful to humans, enabling humans to learn and to produce is incredible. And this concept had its origins back at NCSA because we had this idea that the cool thing about the web was that everyone could be an author, that everyone would generate content. We had the idea that web server software should be free and everyone should run a server on their machine, which maybe that's not the way it worked out. But keep in mind at the time, firewalls were really uncommon. I ran a web server on the PC in my office that you could get to worldwide. All you needed was my IP address. There was no firewall to get to it. And in fact, we wrote a network space dogfighting game as a student project using the NCSA PC Telnet networking code. And after we'd been playing it for a while, I had a thought one day and realized that I'd never explicitly disabled the background FTP server code in the Telnet library. And sure enough, while a friend of mine was running the game, I went and FTP'd into his machine and started copying files off of it. And in fact, that game was called Netspace, which is Netscape with 2 letters reversed. And my co-author for Mosaic for Windows actually went to Netscape. He had helped on this project too. And he kept accidentally typing Netspace when he meant Netscape for years after that. But we implemented in this browser that was totally primitive by today's standards. There was no CSS, there was no JavaScript, no HTML tables, not even any real font control. We implemented a group annotation feature. For any web page, you could write annotations on a common server. And whenever anyone in your group visited those same web pages you'd written annotations for, they would see your annotations too. And this concept that everyone is a content producer probably seems totally obvious now in the age of social media. But this is a huge part of the digital divide between generations. Like, I didn't spend my teens sharing everything I was doing with everyone around me. I didn't take pictures of my meals at restaurants or share cute pictures of my dogs. Well, okay, maybe just one. But in the early days, we were still getting used to producing content. There were actual paper books produced, like this one right here, that were essentially bookmark lists. Half of this book is just URLs with a brief description of the site. But the growth of the web and the fact that everyone can be a publisher enabled this concept of the long tail. Now, the long tail refers to a probability distribution where a large portion of the overall population is in the tail, or to simplify, it means the coolness of the web is because people are just as interested in less common topics as they are in the most popular topics. So for any interest you may have in Major League Football, you probably have an interest in 17th century weaponry or something like that. Now, this is taken for granted today that you can search for anything and find information on it, but that wasn't the world we lived in the early 90s. And in fact, I had a demonstration of this personally later on. In 1996, I took a class in playing the didgeridoo, Australian Aboriginal wind instrument. I've got a couple of them behind me. And part of this class covered how to make your own didgeridoos. And for those of you who remember GeoCities, I put up a GeoCities site showing how to build didgeridoos from pieces of bamboo, complete with ASCII art because I didn't have a digital camera. And I put my Microsoft email address in the page. And this page stayed up until GeoCities shut down in late 2009. And for all that time, for like 13 years, I consistently got like an email every month or two saying things like, hey, I saw your page and I was wondering if you know where to get raw bamboo here in Finland. Now, this page, by the way, is still available on an archive of GeoCities. So if you're interested, but I don't say this because I think many of you are interested in didgeridoos or how to build them, but you probably do have interests that are just as rare, and the world is really different today. By contrast, a couple of years ago, I started building ukuleles in my spare time. Got another one of those behind me too. And I buy my materials and tools online. I watch videos on YouTube of how to bend the sides. I compare notes on forums about various kinds of wood, browse through exotic wood pieces on eBay. And I'm showing my age because I find this information access just mind-blowing. And you probably don't even think about this, but this is a massively new natural order. In a mere couple of decades, we've gone from having to dig to find communities to having instant access across the globe. And this leads me to what I've said since the beginning of my career that excites me about working on the web and the internet, that all the internet, all electronic communication in general does actually, is allow human interactions to happen faster with fewer barriers and guardrails in the way. It obviously removes geographic barriers, even relatively small ones. But I used to think this was an unreservedly good thing, and I'm not sure I personally believe that anymore. Maybe I was naively expecting people to mostly try to do good. But I used to optimize only for enabling humans, and now I think we have a responsibility to discourage tribalism, focus on the truth. This has been my pinned tweet for a really long time. Every decision has consequences. Few optimizations have no side effects. So maybe speeding up human interactions isn't all good all the time. But this is what the web has become the ultimate platform for. Back at Microsoft 20 years ago, I worked alongside and became friends with a brilliant, wonderful person named Bill Hill. He did some seminal research on reading in the 1990s that led to ClearType. It led really to the ebook revolution. And he published a paper called The Magic of Reading. You can still find this online. And it was eye-opening to me on the wisdom of books and printing, like, why are books the size that they are? Why are lines positioned the way that they are? Why, what makes text readable? And the design of books comes from thousands of years of determining what's a convenient and readable format. Now, Bill used the term a 300-page water slide for human attention to describe the power that a good book has to engage us. And that's what I feel the web can be, and sometimes is today, an infinite water slide for human attention. And again, this can be for better or worse. But back to my story. In 1994, the core Mosaic team all left NCSA. Mark and Grayson had left the previous year. I left to go to Seattle. And he and Mark and Jim Clark came back to Illinois to scoop up everyone else on the original Mosaic team before they scattered for the winds to move to Netscape. I went to work for a company called SPRY in Seattle. It's not the same as Spyglass. But we made a product called Internet in a Box. And the only thing that I'll mention about this was that it was the whole package. It was the TCP stack, Usenet browser, email client, FTP client, Gopher client, and web browser. all in the same box, because it still wasn't clear that the web was the winner of these, and really that the browser was everything that you needed. And I won't say anything more about SPRY other than I gained my best friend from that experience and a really strong understanding of Dilbert cartoons. But in 1995, I joined Microsoft and the IE team. Actually, I started on Microsoft working on a different project, but I found out that an engineer with web browser experience had joined the company. Web browsers were only like 2 years old, so they poached me over to the IE team. And I joined right before IE2 shipped. I did one check-in in IE2. And this was just as the web browser was becoming the hottest topic around. Because some of you may have heard of this quote from Mark Andreessen, the co-founder of Netscape, where he was quoted as saying that Netscape would reduce Microsoft Windows to a poorly debugged set of device drivers. Now, to be fair, Mark claims that Bob Metcalfe originated that statement. He was merely retweeting it, well, quoting it, because keep in mind, this was 1995. The concept of JavaScript was barely invented, and Twitter was still a really long way off. Now, this may seem like a cheap shot against Microsoft. I really don't mean it that way, because I didn't believe Mark's statement then. I kept working for Microsoft for another 15 years. I didn't even believe it when I left Microsoft, because I think they're quite well debugged device drivers. But this showed what the stakes were. And Mark's point, of course, was that the web would take over as the center of computing, that the local operating system was effectively dead. And what I don't think I expected or realized is that my expectations of what computing is would change so much. For context, Mark's statement was made 5 years before the first iPod was released, really before the mass adoption of MP3 music. Like, I still have a couple of crates of CDs out in my garage. Now, think of how much computation and functionality has happened since then. This was before Lightroom. This was 8 years before the Canon Digital Rebel. Like, high quality digital photos were really hard to come by. It wasn't something that you carry around in your pocket all the time. And this quote, this shot across Microsoft's bow, really kicked off the browser wars, a no-holds-barred battle between Microsoft and the upstart Netscape. And the easiest example of this, of course, is everyone's favorite HTML tag, the blink tag. Now, Netscape engineers came up with the blink tag one night when they were out at a bar. This is a true story, apparently. Look it up online. But at Microsoft, we hated the blink tag, so much so that even when the Netscape team demanded that it be added to the new CSS standard as a text decoration, we insisted that we not actually be required to blink the text. I parsed it, we would even apply it in the CSS cascade, you could see it in the DOM, but the text wouldn't blink. But of course, we had to outblink blink. So we came up with the marquee tag to get text to scroll around in a really flashy way, let you format text vertically like a Broadway marquee. This was incredibly disastrously eye-catching, even more so than the blink tag. The joke was on us, though, because this ended up being heavily used in Korea, of all places, for formatting purposes, because they use vertical text. And we couldn't remove this for many, many years thereafter because of those uses. In fact, if you search for marquee tag on Google today, there's a cute Easter egg where there's a scrolling marquee of the search results, even though, of course, this uses CSS animation, modern technology to render, not the actual marquee tag. At least we don't support that one anymore. But at this point, we were basically locked in a feature back and forth with Navigator, adding JavaScript, tables, font features. And I know that I'm biased, of course, but I believe we had a better engine even then. For example, our layout engine, which was heavily based on the one that I'd built for Windows Mosaic back at NCSA, it was designed to dynamically reload pages. You could resize the window and we would reflow the text. On the other hand, Netscape Navigator couldn't resize the window without reloading the page. It had a static layout. Literally reload. In fact, in earlier versions of Navigator, they even reloaded from the network if you resized the window. Now, I think this may actually be why they added a disk cache. But even in later versions, they hacked into feature where if you were filling out a form, they would cache the form fields across page loads so that you wouldn't lose all your work if you resized the window and it had to reload the page. Now, This experience in layout, though, did lead me to atone for my overlapping tags sin with a significant addition to the web, because when my manager came to me as we were wrapping up IE2 and said, hey, we think we want you to work on frame sets for IE3, iframes and frame sets. I said, yeah, frame sets are nice, but there are these two guys at the W3C who've been kicking around this idea called style sheets. Netscape's not even looking at this yet, and this kicked me off personally coding the first implementation of CSS in a browser because my manager came back and half an hour later said they'd found someone else to do frame sets. And this is another lesson, by the way. Don't be afraid to speak up, even when you're the new person on the team. Advocate for what you think. And IE3 became, to my mind, really the first serious contender release from Microsoft. IE1 was just a rebranding of Spyglass Mosaic. IE2 added some minor catch-up features like tables, but IE3 was the first release that really added innovative features like CSS. And this showed, by the way, IE's browser market share went from around 5% in early 96 to 25% by late 97. And in addition to CSS, this is also the release where ActiveX support was added. Now that's a whole separate set of talks all by itself. I'm not going to go into that too deeply right now, but it did herald a big change because this was the release where IE itself stopped being a single monolithic executable. It became a set of embedded system APIs and controls that all developers could use. Something that may seem totally obvious now, but it really wasn't at the time. At the time, browsers were just an application you ran, but this was the first web view. And as we wrapped up IE3, there was some contention at Microsoft over that web view. In particular, towards the end of the cycle, there was another team over on the other side of Microsoft who were working on something called Forms Cubed, which was like a dynamic form package. But they apparently were working on a competitive HTML engine. And they invited our team over to a presentation at one point to show off their stuff. And I was busy, so a teammate, a close friend of mine, went over. And he comes back to my office and he sits down and says, we're screwed. We're all out of a job. Because that engine, which was renamed Trident, was completely dynamic. Prior to this time, the only things JavaScript could actually dynamically change in the page were images, but not their size because Netscape couldn't relay out, what URLs links pointed to, and the contents of form input fields. But now anything could be changed in the page dynamically through JavaScript. Prior to this time, there wasn't really even a document object model. I mean, there kind of was. In the early days of the document object model working group, we had this thing we would refer to all the time called the DOM level 0. And there was never actually a DOM level 0 spec. It was just understood to be the baseline of stuff like document.images and document.links that was supported across IE3 and Netscape Navigator. Okay, there were a few things that weren't dynamic in IE4. Notably, you couldn't change the type of an input control. You couldn't change a radio button to a checkbox, for example. And there was a weird internal layout construct that became known as has layout that had really odd, inconsistent consequences in CSS, depending on other properties like zoom or height. But I do want to be clear about one thing. This one was not my fault, people. Trident already had this internal layout construct before I joined the team, because obviously the Trident team was moved over to Internet Explorer. My coworker was mostly right. Almost everyone from the IE3 rendering engine moved on to other projects. I was the only one, in fact, who was asked to stay on in the new IE team, the Trident team, after shipping IE3, and it was because I'd implemented style sheets. In fact, before shipping IE3, but after it became clear that Trident was going to replace us in the next release, the Trident team asked me to come over and give a presentation on CSS in Internet Explorer because they hadn't started implementing it yet. And I gave them a demo. I explained how the CSS cascade works and how margin collapsing worked and all this other stuff. And then I said at the end of the presentation, and I hope to get these 2 more features in before we ship. And their response was literally, well, could you not? Because anything you implement, we have to match. And to myself, I was thinking, just for that, I'm going to implement 3 features before we ship. And I did. So another lesson, job security. Okay, that's kind of a joke, but this was the height of the browser wars era. We were going back and forth with Netscape, including, by the way, a minor battle where Microsoft copyrighted the dynamic HTML term with a capital D, but Netscape copyrighted it with a lowercase d, or maybe it was the other way around, I forget. But fundamentally, it meant neither one of us could use the term dynamic HTML with impunity. But fundamentally, the IE4 Trident engine gave us a quantum leap forward over Netscape Navigator. Now, keep in mind, Netscape they kept delaying the release of their new Mozilla engine. So they were still using their old formatting engine. And they were still trying to do things like propose static layer elements in HTML while we were cranking out dynamic CSS positioning and animations. And we even shipped something called Active Desktop in Windows 98, which was basically a rebuilding of the entire low-level windowing system of Windows, like all of the drag bars and everything, scroll bars, using HTML and CSS in a system that didn't have grid layouts. This was perhaps not the right architectural layering. In fact, we shipped a critical crashing bug in the first release of Windows 98 that was my personal fault, because if you added an unrecognized rule in your user style sheet and you turned on Active Desktop, your system would crash on boot over and over again. Oops. But at the same time, some of these features had long-ranging consequences. In particular, the Outlook team at Microsoft needed a web front end for webmail on Outlook servers. And of course, they realized it was kind of wonky to transfer an entire HTML page over every time the user clicked on a message. So they needed some way to do network data transfer. And a colleague of mine, who I got to work with a lot later on, Alex Hopman, came up with this idea of building a component that could do just that and shipping it as an ActiveX control with IE. And the most convenient vehicle to ship it in was msxml.dll, which shipped with IE. And so this got shipped in Internet Explorer 5, and the whole concept of AJAX was born with XML HTTP request and asynchronous data requests. Now, I was asked on Twitter actually just a few weeks ago, like, why XML HTTP request has such odd capitalization. And I remember that our coding standards at Microsoft at the time had this odd rule that said you should capitalize all the letters of a 2 or 3 letter acronym, but 4 letters or longer should only be camel cased. And I thought this was the oddest thing I'd ever, well, I actually used a different term that was a little more derogatory, but this is, of course, another thing I'm mistakenly blamed for, even by my own team members, but at least it's the gift that keeps on giving. Now, within Microsoft, we kind of lost our way around this time. We were re-architecting to solve a lot of our own problems. Internet Explorer 5.5 was actually almost entirely consumed by what we referred to as the native frames re-architecture to natively support frame encapsulation instead of re-embedding the browser control. So I guess whoever did the frame set implementation didn't do a perfect job. But to put it in a nutshell, Microsoft stumbled pretty hard with the sort of goals, the mission of the browser at that point, mostly because of this. This is the chart from the Wikipedia Browser Wars article. And you'll note in 2001, as IE6 shipped, Microsoft had clearly won the browser wars. Now, we had a vastly better product than Netscape. Our Mac product was better than our Windows product. Yes, we had a Mac Internet Explorer, but we owned over 90% of the market. And the leadership got really complacent about that position. The web as a platform was really far from complete, though. Like, it struggled to lay anything out except tables and flow text. In fact, it took another decade until 2012 for the web to get a solid Flexbox control. And it took even longer to get a solid grid control. And additionally, in Internet Explorer, it was getting hard to change anything that we'd shipped, possibly because Microsoft had an overcommitment to backwards compatibility and at the same time, a pretty, well, let's say quirky implementation of a lot of features. And fundamentally though, from Microsoft's leadership perspective, the web didn't encourage developers to write Windows software. And let's take a look at that chart again. Microsoft had conquered that market. They just wanted to retain it, but they also wanted to connect it to Windows. They wanted the web to be better on Windows and vice versa. And so the Avalon project was born, the .NET Framework 3.0 project. And this was an attempt to take some of the valuable lessons from the web, like markup and code working together, and apply them to a custom platform, a proprietary platform. In reality, this never really took off, and at the same time kind of ended up them losing the web market too, because note that the decline in IE market share started in 2002, 2003. And this, of course, was because the world kept turning while Microsoft was off working on .NET. First of all, hackers started making money off poor security. Like prior to the year 2000 or so, there were certainly hackers out there, but it wasn't big business. You couldn't make a ton of money necessarily by getting malicious software installed on people's computers or getting their account info or things like that. And then we also saw the takeoff of the mashup pattern. Like there were multiple components and data getting combined in the web platform to create new experiences because suddenly they weren't from incompatible sources. You could take the Chicago Crime Statistics database, a mapping control, and mush them together and actually create something really new and exciting in the web because it was all in one accessible platform. And then, of course, there were several really great web engines that were arising as serious competitors to IE in the background. Mozilla finally shipped Firefox. And although WebKit had started back in 1998 as KHTML, it didn't really hit it big until Safari and then later Chrome. And of course, the WWG was formed in response to the slow development of the World Wide Web Consortium standards and the W3C's decision to pretty much abandon HTML at the time in favor of XML technologies. And this statement by Ben Galbraith, who recently rejoined the Chrome team, was one of the best summaries of the changing focus of the web and software in the mid-2000s. Ben said this at, I think, the Ajaxian conference in 2006, that Web 2.0 isn't a set of technologies, it's caring about your user experience. And I think everyone should care and care deeply about their user experience. That should be the focus for us. So this led Microsoft to resuscitate the Internet Explorer team with, of course, what every product revamp needs, a slick new multicolored logo. And I joined this newly back from the dead team in 2004 as the group program manager for the web platform team. Now, we had a daunting task in front of us because the internal knowledge of the web had mostly deteriorated until we managed to rehire some of the great people that slipped away and train up some new people to understand what the web platform really was. And we shipped IE7 in 2006. And on a personal note, I have to say, this was actually the release in my career that I have been most proud of, not because of what we shipped, but because we built the team that shipped it. And we made an incredible amount of progress given where we started from in 2004. Always keep in mind, you can only do the next right thing to do. You can't always repair everything in one go. Granted, we did have lots of fun getting vilified by web developers. That leads me to another lesson. Listen to feedback. Don't let the snarkiness of others get you down. I once had someone in the IE blog comments who was claiming to be Satan, telling me they wanted to hire me, saying they'd offer me more money than Microsoft. And I didn't want to follow up on that at all. So be nice. Don't let the jerks get to you. And as I tell my 15-year-old daughter, don't read YouTube comments at all. Now, I want to point out, by the way, we're only just now getting to the point where Chrome got started. The Chrome project was started in 2006. Since I wasn't at Google at the time, I'm not really going to focus on Chrome at all. But unfortunately, the restarted IE team was charted and directed and resourced to compete as an application. The leadership thought of this as, we need a competitive browser application, not we're responsible for growing and shepherding this wonderful, beautiful underlying web platform. We spent roughly half our engineering resources in every release on user experience revamps. Like this showed in what we accomplished and what the press noticed, like from IE7, tabbed browsing, page zooming, search improvements, and RSS feed reader, and on the platform's side, improved standard support, but doesn't pass the ACID 2 or ACID 3 tests. Now, this trend continued, by the way. Microsoft continued to underinvest in that platform while sinking a lot of work into reworking the user experience. In fact, IE 7, 8, and 9 all had massive revamps to the user experience. Adding things like an RSS feeder was just the first bit. But by contrast to the other engines out there at the time, they really only trickled out web platform enhancements. Despite web developers clamoring for those platform updates. And fundamentally, of course, this is why I left Microsoft in 2010, because I spent a half a decade after that trying to fix the problem and get the leadership to understand what they needed to do and how they needed to invest. And finally, in late 2018, Microsoft realized this continued underinvestment was a recipe for obsolescence. They moved to rebuild Edge on top of Chromium. And to summarize the lessons from IE, aside from the obvious, don't be complacent. First and foremost, invest in infrastructure. I actually think that Chrome does quite well in this, although it's challenging to constantly make infrastructure work attractive. And ironically, I think Microsoft actually invests now a lot more in web infrastructure with Chromium-based Edge than they did for years with the Trident engine. And secondly, a core value at Google too is focus on the user. Don't focus on the race with a competitor. We got into that back and forth with Blink and Marquee and the like, and that was kind of goofy. And third, quirkiness may be really intriguing as a personality trait, but it is maddening as a platform attribute. Spec your behavior carefully, match your implementation to the spec, make sure those two things are converging. And fourth, and this is a really common failure, not all the smart people work for your company, no matter who your company is. Collaborate open and honestly. And finally, don't ignore disruptive factors or potentially disruptive factors. In fact, I haven't even yet mentioned the other factor that really hastened IE's demise, which was the rise of mobile computing. The personal computing revolution radically accelerated with mobile, and Microsoft was caught completely unaware by this. In only a little over a decade, I went from this Motorola StarTAC, and believe me, it was incredibly advanced when it came out, to a Samsung Blackjack with a web browser and email on it, to an iPhone. And the iPhone was so groundbreaking because it enabled building these responsive, engaging experiences because of all the amazing interactivity on this device. Like the touchscreen was amazingly engaging. Like I was shocked at how much it added to the experience and how the accelerometer was actually a really good functional gaming controller. Now, for context, at the time the iPhone was released, I was over 35 years old, so this was definitely against the natural order of things to me. Now, unfortunately, as mobile computing started taking over, the web was certainly not optimized for small touchscreen devices at the time. Although web layout was a reflow model, at the time there were really few controls to carefully design for a given form factor. And interestingly, certainly not something we see today, the hardware status quo in the late 90s and early 2000s had led authors to hard code their screen-based designs, usually to 1024 by 768, because that was the most common screen size. This caused some problems when the iPhone came out, and suddenly a portrait layout 360 by 480 screen was very common as well. And of course, there was no mouse and no keyboard. But more than anything, the web platform relied on an always-on net connection. Native apps always seem reliable because they work. They load and run when you're in an elevator with no net connection. Sometimes they don't do much useful. I mean, Twitter isn't so useful without an updated feed, but the app still loads and it shows something. And even more importantly for this, the user isn't confused about whether native apps should work without bandwidth. You're kind of surprised when they don't. Most users, however, won't intentionally open up their mobile web browser to do something when they know they don't have a net connection. And that's what led us 5 years or so ago to address this with progressive web apps, to improve the reliability of web apps by making them work offline or in low and uncertain bandwidth, to make them work as an integrated app experience on devices rather than forcing users to open a web browser first. So that's what put us on a path to expand the web's capabilities as well, to enable access to hardware features on modern devices. The web needs to be more than just a net browser. It has to be a fast and reliable and engaging platform. And this is the challenge ahead of us. We're finally starting to improve the web's ability to absorb new computing technologies. And one reason that I'm convinced the web platform will continue to succeed as this universal platform is that access to capabilities in the web platform continues to catch up. We've been taking on new devices and local hardware, new form factors, new capabilities like augmented reality. And the challenge for us, of course, is leading what developers want to build, but still taking these new capabilities and responsibly enabling them on the web. So as a colleague of mine, Svea Siegman, said to me a while ago, we should strive to make the web a good place, not just a technically accurate one. Many of you are new to Chrome or not in Chrome, and I think it's great to have a continuously fresh perspective. So don't lose that. We should definitely strive to continue to be agnostic and altruistic, and that's hard to do if you have a static perspective. So with that, I want to conclude my talk. I know I'm running a little bit tight on time, but we've got a couple questions on the board, and I did want to mention I will definitely be in the hallway track after this as well. So let's see, the first question I had was, what does the future of the web look like? And I think the challenge that the web faces is how to enable better and better experiences and access to more and more of what we consider to be the parts of our life without losing some of the attributes that it's had, the ephemerality of the web, and the idea that you can have a safe, secure, and private communication. I think it's great, for example, that with Web MIDI, I can connect all the gear behind me in my studio and get software updates and new sounds and patches over the web without needing to install software. At the same time, like, I don't want people fingerprinting me based on all the gear sitting around me either. So there are a lot of challenges as we move forward to see what that new app model looks like and how to grow it. I think we will continue to see a better, faster, and richer web as we go on. And to me, this becomes just the fabric underneath computing. Like, I'm sitting at a desk with one computer and 3 screens in front of me, and I think I don't have anything other than web browser windows open right now, because that's what I do all my work in. And if you think of the web as kind of this underlying fabric and operating system for computing, it can be really powerful. The other question I saw was, with native apps being mainstream, what is the web doing to stay competitive? This is a challenging one, because I think some of the things, well, no, I'll just come right out and say, I think native app platforms can always run ahead of a shared consensus-driven open platform, because we have to be super careful about how this will work across different scenarios. And in a native platform, you can frequently come up with a solution and ship it, and you're done. But I think in terms of the web staying competitive, looking at all the scenarios that block people from new experiences and new scenarios are the interesting bit, like the important bit for us to do. So as we look at new APIs and taking on new areas like augmented reality and virtual reality, and adding support for Bluetooth devices and the like, I think we're really starting to see how we can be competitive, but at the same time, improve the app experience for web applications as well. So with that, I'm going to conclude. Thank you very much. And I will hopefully see you in the hallway track. Also, feel free to email me or contact me on Twitter. Thanks.